Siddhi Hung Ngonga Hung Benza Guru Pema Siddhi Hung Ngonga Hung Benza Guru Pema Siddhi Hung. Welcome everyone to my weekly Dharma talk at the new time, 2 p.m. Second Lifetime on Sunday instead of Saturday. I hope this time is working out for you. Today we're going to be discussing the Mahanidana Sutta, the 15th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. Before I begin, I'll just put, there we go. There's my personal information, so I won't bore you with it every time, for those of you who are new. In particular, the only thing I'll point out in that list is that if you do have a question, please feel free to ask it during the course of the talk. So, the title of today's sutta is The Great Discourse on Causation, and the Buddha is staying amongst the Kurus, a country in the northwest region of the 16 great republics of Northeast India at that time, 5th century BCE India. The Kuru kingdom was an ancient Vedic Aryan tribal kingdom, the first one, in fact, to emerge as a state around the year 1000 before the Common Era. Here the Vedic hymns were arranged into collections. Here Vedic ritual life is born. The Kuru kingdom was also oppressive and warlike. The great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, is set here. By the time of the Buddha, however, Kuru was in decline and had acquired a reputation as a backwater. The Buddha was staying in the jungle outside a market town called Mahanidana. In the Majjhima Nikaya, we learn that the people of Mahanidana are good Buddhists. So we're going to begin with the talk discussing dependent origination, the doctrine of Paticcasamuppada. Here we have a sutta featuring a conversation between the Buddha and Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant for the final 25 years of his life. I believe this is the first question. Yes, a glow phoenix. I see a question. While you're typing, I'll just mention that I believe this is the first sutta we've encountered so far which has a direct conversation between the Buddha and Ananda. Such suttas are going to be of particular interest, I suspect, because of Ananda's importance in terms of the recitation of the Pali Canon and in terms of his personal relationship to the Buddha. So, Glow Phoenix, you have a question. I'll just carry, oh, there it is. On the map were the three Naga areas, lakes, or lands. I believe this is that map. Let's go back to it. This map is pre-Buddhist. It's from the time of the Mahabharata, I believe. And I haven't read the Mahabharata, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but I believe those are tribal peoples, the Naga. I think those are peoples. And what their significance is in relation to Kuru, I don't know. I haven't studied the Mahabharata. If anyone knows or thinks to look it up on the Wikipedia while I'm presenting the talk, I'd be happy to learn that myself. But I believe they are peoples, tribal peoples. This map's probably from around the, well, it's difficult to say. Kuru, the dates for Kuru, I think, are given something like 1200 BCE to, I think I saw 800 or so BCE. So this map probably dates from somewhere in there. It's definitely pre-Buddhist. And if you actually go to the blog where this talk will be posted, I have a different map on the blog, and it shows Kuru in relation to Kosala and Magadha and other places that we've already talked about that are the more Northeast India. Yes, the Buddha lived in and taught exclusively in Northeast India, and the Naga are a tribe. Great, I was right. So the map on the blog will show the Kuru. It's in the northwest region of the 16 great republics, and the northwest of where the Buddha usually taught. I don't think Kuru is that commonplace. One of the things I'm going to do at the end of this series of talks is count up the different places where he taught and how often they appear. But this is on the northwest extent of his teaching activity, I believe. So, Ananda famously, let me just go on to the next one. There we go. So this sutta features a conversation between the Buddha and Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant for the final 25 years of his life. Ananda famously informs the Buddha how profound and clear he finds the doctrine of dependent origination. A very famous quotation, in fact. You find it in popular accounts of Buddhism all the time. Walsh uses the phrase, of course, dependent origination to translate paticcasamuppada. We talked about different translations of that term in a previous talk. And we've had, I have discussed this concept also from time to time in previous talks. Ananda is clearly very pleased with himself that the Buddha chastises his disciple. Ananda is often portrayed as being a bit wayward, reprimanding him for thinking that the paticcasamuppada is clear. Quote, "Do not say that, Ananda, do not say that. This dependent origination is profound, and appears profound," unquote. The Buddha declares that, quote, "It is through not understanding, not penetrating this doctrine, that this generation has become like a tangled ball of string, covered as with a blight, tangled like coarse grass, unable to pass beyond states of woe, the ill destiny, ruin, and the round of birth and death," unquote. On the other hand, it is through understanding dependent origination, therefore, that one untangles the string of samsara and so achieves emancipation. The Buddha's implication is clearly that Ananda has not yet achieved emancipation. In fact, according to tradition, Ananda would not become an arhat until after the Buddha's death, shortly after the Buddha's death. Although the metaphor of the ball of string is applied to this generation, tangled, blighted, trapped in samsara, the image clearly also applies to the doctrine of dependent origination itself, in which everything is infinitely intervolved based on the operation of the law of karma. The Buddha's attitude to Ananda's generation is suggestive of the attitude of Yeshua to his, Yeshua also known as Jesus. In his search for the ultimate solution of the problem of dissatisfaction, the Buddha begins with aging and death. Thus, the Buddha's inquiry is rational, and it starts with the immediacy of lived experience, rather than with an abstract metaphysical system or postulate, as other ancient theosophical systems were wont to do, including Indian philosophy. In this respect, the Buddha is exquisitely modern. In Western philosophy, we find this kind of attitude only arose in the last 150 years with the advent of phenomenology, existentialism, and similar philosophies. Relentlessly, the Buddha pursues the chain of cause and effect. Aging and birth is conditioned, or aging and death, I should say, is conditioned by birth. The connection seems incontrovertible. Birth is conditioned by becoming. Becoming is conditioned by clinging. Clinging is conditioned by craving. Craving is conditioned by feeling. Feeling is conditioned by contact. Contact is conditioned by mind and body. Mind and body is conditioned by consciousness. The Buddha identifies four kinds of clinging. Sensuous clinging, clinging to views, which we might term dogmatic sectarianism, clinging to rituals, clearly related to the former, and clinging to the personality, which we might call ego, which actually is another translation of the word atta, or self. Together, mind, body, and consciousness condition each other. Thus, mind and body conditions consciousness, and consciousness conditions mind and body. The arrow of time, originating in the double dyad of mind, body, and consciousness, develops through the chain of dependent origination until it results in birth, aging, and death, only to recur eternally until the cycle is broken and one achieves emancipation. This, of course, is the definition of samsara. The chain of dependent origination takes different forms in different suttas. Sometimes consciousness is conditioned by mental formations or sanskaras. Sometimes that's translated volitional impressions. They're the karmic potentialities which underlie rebirth, which are in turn conditioned by ignorance or avijja, which is, in those suttas which include it, declared to be the root of the chain despite the chain's cyclical nature. In this variation, that is the variation presented in this sutta, there are 9 links, somewhat unusually, and the root is declared to be feeling, also unusual, the 6th link in the chain, counting from aging and death. Note that the 6 sense bases, that is to say the 6 senses, the 6 sense faculties, 6 because, of course, as I've mentioned before, mind in Buddhism is considered to be a sense organ. Given in the version of this diagram that we encountered in the last talk, are missing in this version. So this version of the Paticcasamuppada has 9 links, or nidanas. In this variation, the Buddha is focused on the problem of craving, and declares that if the feeling born of sensory contact were to cease, so would craving. This word, feeling, is Pali Vedana, a feeling, perception, sensation, pain, suffering. The context suggests that the Buddha is referring to the craving for pleasure and its corollary, the aversion towards pain. If there were absolutely no feeling towards pleasure and pain, the absence and cessation of feeling will break the chain of cause and effect that leads to craving, thus effecting emancipation. Oops, pardon me. There we go. Didn't mean to move that slide then. So let's go on to discuss the interdependence of craving, territoriality, property, money, and war. At this point in the sutta, the Buddha segues into another application of the doctrine of the Paticcasamuppada, commencing with the faculty of craving. Quote, and so Ananda, feeling conditions craving, unquote. Now the Buddha creates a new Paticcasamuppada, showing that the doctrine is not just the diagram, but the principle or method, and that many Paticcasamuppada sequences are theoretically possible. Although these are the only 2 that I'm aware of, perhaps we'll discover another one in the texts. In this segue, craving therefore conditions seeking this time. So a new link, seeking. Seeking conditions acquisition. Acquisition conditions decision-making. Decision-making conditions lust. Lust conditions attachment. Attachment conditions appropriation. Appropriation conditions avarice. Avarice conditions possessiveness. And because of possessiveness, there arise violence, quarrels, disputes, arguments, strife, abuse, lying, and other evil, unskilled states, unquote. I see a question. Glow Phoenix asks, if the spheres of sensation are one, then how may contact be stopped? Not quite sure that I understand the first half of your question, but the second half of the question I can address, which is that if you look at the links in the chain of cause and effect, which is the paticca, I see. Sensory organs, minds, and objects are all one thing. I see what you mean. Okay. The answer I was going to give still applies then to your question. If you look at the chain of conditioned arising, dependent origination, whatever term you wish to use, and you go through the linkages, you will see that most of these things are things over which we have no control, or largely have no control due to the influence of karma. Obviously, we can't just pick the top one, birth, old age, suffering, and death. There's not much we can do about that, nor is there much we can do, as you've pointed out, about the unity, the internal and external unity of the sensory faculties or sensory organs. We have the subjective faculty, the objective object, and the faculty itself, the three of which combine to form the experience of perception. The internal and the external are clearly related in some fundamental ontological sense, which is how we have the experience of reality as distinct from the experience of fantasy, and we distinguish between the two. Most of these things, karma obviously from the past, most of these things are not things that we have control over. However, if you go through the sequence, you will find two things in the list which do which relate to consciousness and which are addressable by intention or volition. And we're going to be discussing that a little bit later, but those two things are, of course, desires, attachment, and ignorance. And these are things that we are not automatic automatons. Because we exist in reality, and reality is fundamentally free, our essence is also free, and in respect of those two particular links, we do have the capacity to change our own nature. And because we have that capacity, we have the capacity to escape from the chain of cause and effect. So that's the answer to your question. Argus Portal asks, sorry for my English, I can try to use other words if it is not clear. Is there a point of no return in the mechanism to overcome craving by ceasing the sensual functions, or is one depending from never stop meditation? Sensory deprivation, which is what I assume you're referring to, is not specifically addressed by the Buddha, but it certainly is an aspect of meditation, and in particular, it relates to sensory dispassion, or the negation of sensory attachment, which is subject to volition. So yes, implicitly, the concept of sensory deprivation is at least part of the process of meditation. It's a process of conscious withdrawal from attachment to the sense objects. And I would say, yes, that is definitely implicit in the structure or mechanism, as you put it. A Glow Phoenix says, I see. Buddha is not suggesting that we can stop contact with objects. No. Although there is the qualification of sensory deprivation that I just mentioned. But the two primary paths identified by the Buddha, and you see this throughout the Pali Canon, and you even see a tension between these two paths, and I will be discussing this, but these are the path that addresses desires attachment, which of course is renunciation or dispassion. I've come to like the word dispassion, and I'm using it more and more often. That is not the root of the chain. You will notice it is about halfway through the sequence. The root of the chain is ignorance, and that refers to the other path, which is the cultivation of wisdom or gnosis. And this is something I've talked about in other talks, the salvific quality of wisdom as the primary principle of liberation in the Pali Canon. The path of dispassion is a secondary path. The primary path is the path of wisdom. And this is clear when you read the experiences of how the Buddha taught and the experiences of the Arahants in the Pali Canon. So, carrying on. Wisdom cuts the root. Yes, that's exactly it. Wisdom cuts the root. And this is something I emphasize because it's something that isn't emphasized in the West by Buddhist teachers today. We see a very strong emphasis on monasticism. We see a very strong emphasis on meditation. We see a very strong emphasis on morality. but we don't see as strong a recognition of the salvific character of wisdom in Western Buddhism, and it is very important. If you study the Pali Canon, you will see that very clearly. So, carrying on, together, mind, body, and consciousness condition each other. Thus, mind and body conditions consciousness, and consciousness conditions mind and body. Conditions is really just a fancy word for causes. The arrow of time, originating in the double dyad of mind, body, and consciousness, develops through the chain of dependent origination until it results in birth, aging, and death, or birth, aging, suffering, and death, as some of the texts put it. Something we know too well, only to recur eternally until the cycle is broken and one achieves emancipation. The chain of dependent origination takes different forms in different suttas. Sometimes consciousness is conditioned by mental formations, or sanskaras, which are in turn conditioned by ignorance, or avijja, which is declared to be the root of the chain, as I've just mentioned, despite its cyclical nature. And this doctrinal declaration that ignorance is the root corresponds exactly to how the path is presented in the Pali Canon, where wisdom is preeminently emphasized. And this just shows how the Nikayas are all of a piece, that it would be naive to suggest that the words of the Pali Canon record, in a literal sense, the words of the Buddha, and yet we do find a remarkable consistency and clarity of doctrine throughout the Nikayas, in which each part supports and reinforces the other parts, which can reinforces our confidence that these teachings, even if they're not literally the words of the Buddha, do in fact preserve his teachings and philosophy. So ignorance is declared to be the root of the chain despite its cyclical nature, and in this variation, the one in this sutta, there are 9 links, and the root is declared to be feeling. So this is a little different in this sutta. And the 6th link in the chain is feeling, counting from aging and death. Note that the 6 sense bases given in the version of this diagram that we encountered in the last talk are missing in this version, so the sense organs, the 6 senses are missing as well. Obviously, there's going to be variations between the texts. In this version, the Buddha is focused on the problem of craving and declares that if the feeling born of sensory contact were to cease, so would craving. So we're talking about desirous attachment here, the second path that I was talking about, the subordinate path, if you want to put it that way. The word feeling is Pali Vedana, feeling, which is translated feeling, perception, sensation, pain, suffering. Am I repeating myself? It seems to me that I am. Anyone recognize what I'm saying? I think I'm repeating myself, am I not? We had already gone on to the interdependence of craving, territorial property, money, and war, I believe. However, I'll continue. This word feeling is Pali Vedana, feeling, perception, sensation, pain, suffering. The context suggests that the Buddha is referring to the craving for pleasure, and its corollary, the aversion towards pain. If there were absolutely no feeling towards pleasure and pain, the absence and cessation of feeling will break the chain of cause and effect that leads to craving, thus affecting emancipation. So that is the path of desirelessness, the monastic path, the path of the Arahant, as presented in the Pali Canon. So let's go on to discuss the interdependence of craving, territoriality, property, money, and war. And those of you who have been attending these talks know that I've talked about the Buddha's political philosophy from time to time. There are passages in different places in the Sutta Pitaka in which he discusses politics. It's not surprising that he would have a political philosophy, given his background as the son of a chieftain. And it pops up from time to time, and here's another opportunity where it does that. Argus Portal, however, asks, you mentioned some minutes ago that nowadays, as example, meditation is too much emphasized. I didn't actually say too much. I said it's emphasized where wisdom is not. And wisdom is less emphasized, yes. How do you define wisdom? As far as I understood, wisdom comes through meditation. Yes, that is the claim, that is the view of those who emphasize meditation, based on the sequence of the threefold classification of the Noble Eightfold Path. The threefold classification was introduced by a nun named Mahanidana, I believe, and the Buddha embraced this classification. Nonetheless, the sequence of the Noble Eightfold Path and the sequence of the threefold classification do differ from each other, and the sequence of the threefold classification has become very popular in monastic and Theravada circles, where it goes in the order of morality, meditation, wisdom, and wisdom is presented as though it were simply the result of meditative practice. This is something that we do not observe in practice. Certain insights certainly do come from meditation, but this is not how the Buddha taught in the Pali Canon, and it is not the sequence of the Noble Eightfold Path. I am grateful to Dr. Peter Macefield in his book Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon for this insight, where he recognizes that wisdom is the first step in the Noble Eightfold Path, followed by morality and finally meditation. It is wisdom that leads to the second step of the second level, if you like, of a Buddhist practitioner. Before you get to the Noble Eightfold Path, there's two levels mentioned in the Pali Canon. There's the faith follower and the Dharma follower. The Dharma follower develops confidence in the teachings of the Buddha based on his understanding of the philosophy. This then leads to right view, which is the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is again relates to wisdom, and it is not till later that meditation becomes significant. So yes, this is a view that the sequence is morality, meditation, and culminating in wisdom, which is entirely the result of meditation. And therefore, according to those who follow this view, some of those who follow this view, the cultivation of reason or wisdom or insight is, in itself, is not important. Only the cultivation of meditation is important, and it will automatically result in wisdom. This is not my view. I don't believe this is consistent with the Pali Canon. I don't believe it's consistent either with the theory of the Pali Canon or with the way that the Buddha taught Dharma during his 45 years of teaching practice. So that is a difference. The threefold classification is certainly a valid classification, but it is not sequential. It is not intrinsically sequential, whereas the Noble Eightfold Path is intrinsically sequential. And thus, I take the view that I've just explained. So I believe that answers your question. A Glow Phoenix says, so reduce craving for pleasure, not reduce all feelings. Well, feeling in the, I don't know if any of you studied Jung, but in the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, feeling is one of the four functions of the psyche, along with thinking, sensation, and intuition. And the Jungian view of feeling is exactly the same as the Buddhist view of feeling, or in which feeling is basically the reaction to sensation, or the perception of sensation, which results in feelings of pleasure, pain, or neutral feelings. So feeling is bound up with pleasure and pain. And in the presentation in this sutta, the Buddha says that we should anesthetize, if you like, our reactions to pleasure and pain so that we do not distinguish between them or have any attachment to them. That, in essence, is dispassion, or the detachment from craving. A Glow Phoenix says, not sure what your first NTS stands for. NTS, out that the basis of samsara is inseparable from the scent of awakening. Not quite clear what that that's not a question either, but I'm not quite clear what that statement is. Maybe you could just clarify it, and clarify it in particular if you have a question there. Argus Portal says, so we have to think to achieve wisdom. Absolutely, yes. You cannot, this is my beef, if you like, with certain ways in which Buddhism is being taught in the West. You cannot escape, it's escapism to think that you can simply meditate your way to nirvana and never cultivate your rational comprehension or understanding. The cultivation of wisdom is part of the path, and perhaps even the most important part. I would argue it's the most important part, based on the teachings of the Pali Canon. I will be discussing this in the course as relevant suttas come up. I can justify this statement on the basis of various passages from various suttas, so I will be documenting this assertion as we progress through the suttas. And I would also say that you cannot master, you do have to transcend intellect. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Emancipation is not an intellectual act or an intellectual attainment merely, but you cannot master reason or intelligence or intellect, whatever, or understanding, whatever term you want to use. You cannot master this without developing it to its fullest extent. And then, to use the word that Padmasambhava used, you take the leap beyond reason into the transrational. But you cannot get there without the cultivation of wisdom. And I'm glad to hear that UIN Buddhism points this out. I'm certainly not saying all Buddhist teachers say this or do this or commit this error, but it is an error that I find, particularly in popular Buddhism in the West, I find I do find this fairly frequently. And in my opinion, those who practice this non-intellectual meditation-only approach or meditation and morality approach are really misguided. They're really seeking escape in the bad sense of escapism. Glow Phoenix nods. Feelings or thoughts are considered by Jung to be judgmental. Yes, thinking is or feeling rather is a rational function in Jung. So yes, it is a judgment, and we formulate the judgment on the basis of our reaction of pleasure and pain. That's the root of judgment, including moral judgment. So morality is an aspect of feeling. I'm just looking through the chat. Sabi says, this is odd, but in Spanish, feelings can be sensaciones or reacciones or emociones. I don't know what that does to Jung's or to the Buddha's writings. Neither do I, since I don't know Spanish, so I'm sorry, I can't really comment on that. Sensaciones is presumably sensation, which is one of the four functions in Jung. Reacciones is reaction, so that would be the result of the judgment of feeling. So that would be the result of it. And emociones, emotion is a concept which we could do a whole talk on the mapping the English word emotion onto Buddhism, and I don't want to get into that today. Walsh, actually, interestingly, says sanskaras could be translated as emotions. So emotion is an amorphous word, which probably maps onto Buddhist thinking in a variety of different ways. Glow Phoenix says sensation and intuition are to be based on neutrality. Well, Jung uses the word irrational or non-rational. Sensation and intuition are non-rational in the sense that they are given by experience, whereas thinking and feeling are rational in the sense that they result of a rational or judgmental process. Glow Phoenix says, repeatedly point out that viewing Buddhism as primarily forms of aversion is a mistake. Yes, actually, intense aversion is really a form of attachment, and it can become attachment to the path, or attachment to the goal, which can actually impede progress. So yes, that's correct. So at this point in the Sutta, the Buddha segues into another application of the doctrine of the Paticca Samuppada, and as I mentioned, I have mentioned that the Buddha had a political philosophy before, and here again we're encountering an aspect of that in the suttas. Commencing from the faculty of craving, quote, and so Ananda feeling conditions craving, unquote. Now the Buddha creates a new Paticcasamuppada, showing that the doctrine is not just the diagram, but the principle or method, and that many Paticcasamuppada sequences are theoretically possible, as one would of course expect in a doctrine where everything is connected to everything else, probably infinite number. In this segue craving, therefore, condition seeking, which is a new term, so we're going off perpendicular from the Paticcasamuppada to another one. Craving, conditions seeking, seeking conditions acquisition, acquisition conditions decision-making, decision-making conditions lust, and yes, I do remember saying this now. Lust conditions attachment, attachment conditions appropriation, appropriation conditions avarice, avarice conditions possessiveness, and because of possessiveness there arise violence, quarrels, disputes, arguments, strife, abuse, lying, and other evil, unskilled states, unquote. In a remarkable anticipation of communism, the Buddha identifies property as the root cause of all of the rest. In this way, the Buddha applies the doctrine of the Paticcasamuppada to the problem of the origin and development of human society and social organization. In the Buddha's analysis, property, money, and war are all interconnected, and these are all negative factors connected to the factor of craving, which is in turn the cause of bondage to samsara. These other suttas, other passages which we'll come to, in which the Buddha discusses the fall of man, humanity, the human beings from a higher deva world, and he associates this fall with, again, in a different way, with the appearance of lust, craving, and then these develop into the desire for sensual experience, which then develops into territoriality, possessiveness, property, and finally the authoritarian social organizations, which then in turn precipitate wars and conflict. We have discussed the Buddha's politics in previous talks as well, where I have identified the Buddha's political position with what we would today call social democracy. The Dalai Lama, as I have also mentioned before, does refer to himself as a Marxist, and this is on record. He was actually a member of the People's Republic of China before, in the early days, he cooperated with Mao, and then broke with him because of China's betrayal of its commitment to Tibet. Although the Buddha positions himself in relation to the mercantile economy of his time, a society, in fact, very similar to our own, in miniature, but nonetheless the social dynamics of Northeast India in the 5th century BC are remarkably similar to the social dynamics in the world today. There are also favorable references to communism in the Pali Canon, which I've mentioned in previous talks, but Marxist materialism, of course, is inconsistent with the Buddhist point of view, as is determinism as well. Marxist determinism is also inconsistent with the Buddhist worldview. The Buddha's analysis is suggestive of that of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. For example, the chapter from the Tao Te Ching, third, I believe. I didn't actually write down which one it was, but I think it's the third. If there were no rulers, there would be no wars. If there were no treasures, the people would not commit crimes. If there were nothing to excite desire, the heart of the people would be content. Truly, in order for the sage to heal, he makes his heart empty, fills the belly, weakens the will, strengthens the bones. If the people are ignorant, they will not covet. It would not be wise to oppose this, acting without action, ruling without rule. And that's my translation. I'm coming out with the translation this April, my own translation of the Tao Te Ching, for anyone who might be interested. A glow phoenix says, territory and property acquisition is the key to social decline when moving from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. Yes. In fact, there's reference somewhere in the Pali Canon, which I'm sure we'll come upon, which is very similar to it, really seems to describe the hunter-gatherer stage of human civilization. Craving, moreover, has two aspects: craving in itself, which serves as the basis of rebirth, and which is the craving that we see in the primary diagram, which we originally discussed and which one sees throughout the Pali Canon, and craving in action, or craving seeking, which in Pali is samudachara tanha, which is the craving of the secondary paticca samuppada, which we've just discussed. So let's go on to discuss the interdependence of Namarupa and Vijnana. So this is an opportunity. I've been wanting to get into a little bit into this very interesting dyad of Namarupa and Vijnana. I've been waiting for an opportunity to do this, where I wouldn't be straying too far from the Sutta, and finally this opportunity has arisen. We have discussed the duality of the psychosomatic complex, as I'm terming it, consisting of nama, literally mind or name, again, compare Lao-Tzu, and rupa, which means matter, form, or image, and vijnana, which is generally translated consciousness, life force, mind, or discernment. The Pali English Dictionary refers to Namarupa as a dyadic unity, a duality in unity, so that the duality of Namarupa and Vijnana becomes a second or double dyad, and therefore a kind of quaternary, or quaternary, I guess, which, of course, if you studied Jung, I sense that some of you have studied Jung. Jung says that the quaternary is, of course, the basis of the mandala. And in fact, you'll see it right there in the diagram of samsara. In this complex, which Bhikkhu Bodhi describes as a vortex, a word also used by Padmasambhav, Nama and Vijnana both refer to the mental aspect, which together constitute the Namakaya, the name body, literally. Similarly, the physical aspect is the Rupakaya, literally the form body, mind and matter. The two, in Western metaphysical philosophy, of course, the two fundamentals, mind and matter. In both of these constructions, body has the connotation of an aggregate or assemblage. It is not a unity, it is a complex. It is complex. The Buddha observes that in the absence of mental properties, features, signs, or indications, those are his words, properties, features, signs, or indications, quote unquote, the mind does not grasp at body, nor does the body grasp at sensory reaction by the mind factor, that's the term that Walsh uses in his translation. In his concept of properties, features, signs, or indications, the Buddha is getting at exactly the same concept as Lao-Tzu, and in his term Ming, again in the Tao Te Ching, and again quoting, this time from chapter 1, the famous chapter of the Tao Te Ching, the speech that can be spoken is not the true speech. The name, that is the Ming, that can be named is not the true name. The nameless creates heaven and earth. The named is the mother of the 10,000 things. Therefore, he who desires not sees the subtle, whereas he who desires much sees the commonplace. And again, that's my translation. The Buddha implies that it is the Vijnana that enters into, quote unquote, the mother's womb, whereas the psychosomatic complex, the Namarupa, develops there. Thus, Vijnana, or consciousness, is the originating non-corporeal principle, whereas the psychosomatic complex is associated with the body. Thus, Vijnana is the psychic element, whereas Nama is akin to what we ordinarily call bodily consciousness, or mind immersed in the somatic element. Quote, thus far then, Ananda, can we trace birth and decay, death and falling into other states, and being reborn. Thus far extends the way of designation, of concepts. Thus far is the sphere of understanding. Thus far the round goes as far as can be discerned in this life, namely to body and mind together with consciousness, unquote. So now let's carry on to discuss the self, the atta. From consciousness, the Buddha from consciousness, the Buddha segues to various conceptions of the self as material and limited, material and unlimited, immaterial and limited, or immaterial and unlimited, thus defining the self in terms of the two axes of materiality, immateriality, and finitude, infinitude. This is like a classification of existing attitudes to the self that he finds in his contemporaries. And Aglow Phoenix says, I am always impressed with the variety of views you cover. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to read. I didn't intend to read that. It's a little self-congratulatory. So this historical classification or analysis of the existing concepts of the self, he explains in terms of the two axes of materiality, immateriality, and infinitude, finitude, infinitude. The Buddha then adds a third axis, time. Either the self is now or will be in the future. The Buddha contrasts all of these theories with the negative form of the same propositions, somewhat artificially, I would say. I would say that actually was done in order to create a logical structure. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me if you analyze it, but that's neither here nor there. The Buddha contrasts all of these theories in the negative form with the negative form of the same propositions. Thus, he posits a sort of tetralemma, and you may recall the tetralemma from our discussion of the first sutta, the logical quaternary formulation that we discussed in connection with the first sutta. The A is not A is neither A nor not A is both neither A nor not A. Something like that. I don't think I quite got it right, but you get the concept. All possible logical expressions of a statement. But what asks the Buddha is the self? What are its specific characteristics? Here the Buddha explores various identifications of the self as feeling or not feeling. With respect to feeling, he points out that feelings, pleasant, painful, or neutral, as we've discussed, are impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen. This transitoriness, or anicca, is incompatible with the idea of a self as a permanent entity, so it is not proper to say that feeling is the self. This is a variation, of course, of the Indian neti meditation. Not this, not this. When you try to find the self, you have a concept of the self, but when you try to find it, you discover you can't find it. It doesn't correspond to anything experienceable. On the other hand, the view that the self is not feeling is self-contradictory because in such a state there is no idea of I am, whereas obviously the concept of a self posits the concept of I am. Similarly, if the self is asserted to feel but not be identical with feeling, that is to say it has feeling as a quality, in the absence of feeling there is no idea of I am this. Therefore, it's not proper to say that the self is not feeling or impercipient in Walsh's translation. Thus, when a monk no longer regards feeling as the self, and I'm quoting here, thus, quote, when a monk no longer regards feeling as the self or the self as being impercipient, or as being percipient and of a nature to feel, by not so regarding he clings to nothing in the world. Not clinging, he is not excited by anything, and not being excited, he gains personal liberation, quote unquote. That is to say, he gains liberation for himself alone. There is no salvation for others. There is no vicarious atonement. In the Buddha Dharma, each one has to earn their own salvation. The sutta goes on to discuss the post-mortem status of the Tathagata. You can see this relationship of the concepts here, self to now the question of the self of the Tathagata. One question that arose early in Buddhist, in early Buddhist thought, is of course the post-mortem status of a Tathagata, a perfectly enlightened Buddha who will never again be reborn. Thus, the Buddha says, quote, If anyone were to say to a monk I've got a typo here. If anyone were to say to a monk whose mind was thus freed, that Tathagata exists after death, that would be seen by him as a wrong opinion and unfitting, unquote. This is the first statement he makes. Thus it appears at this stage that there is no post-mortem state for a Tathagata, despite the Buddha's persistent references throughout the Pali Canon to the deathless, quote unquote. And I believe there are Buddhist schools who do take this view, that the state of a Tathagata is simply a state of nihility. Glow Phoenix asks, what is Buddha's relationship between awareness and self? When I look for myself, I find awareness. It depends what you mean by awareness, I would say. This is going beyond the Sutta. I would say that what you find when you look for the self is the quality of sentience itself. Sentience without content. But when you've tried to reify that perception in terms of something experienceable, that is to say, other than sentience itself, you find there is no self. The Buddha is addressing a particular conception of self which he found in Indian philosophy. It's a particularistic, static, extended concept of self. It's actually represented in the Vedic tradition as a little man, quote unquote, a little man, a microcosm who lives in the heart and proceeds from birth to birth, an essential or permanent being, an essential or permanent identity that transmigrates or reincarnates from birth to birth. And this is the concept of a self that the Buddha is criticizing. It is not that the Buddha says there is no self in any sense. Obviously there is. Here we are. As you say, you have the experience of self. But when you attempt to reify this concept into a concept like a soul or a spirit that inhabits the body, that is permanent and blissful, this is the concept of self that he's criticizing as being illusory. Where am I? So he says, if anyone were to say to a monk whose mind was thus freed that Tathagata exists after death, that would be seen by him as a wrong opinion and unfitting, quote unquote. Thus it appears at first that there is no post-mortem state for a Tathagata, despite the Buddha's persistent references throughout the Pali Canon to the deathless. And I do believe there are schools of Buddhism which do hold that the state of a Tathagata is essentially nihility. There is no post-mortem state for a Tathagata. However, this passage appears to affirm a form of nihilism, except, and that the Buddha continues, quote, likewise, the Tathagata does not exist, both exists and does not exist, neither exists nor does not exist. So there's the classical form of the tetralemma. He's rejecting the postulate in every possible logical variation. Thus, the Buddha sets up a tetralemma refuting every logical variation concerning the Tathagata's existence or non-existence after death, including the statement that the Tathagata does not exist, which is equally declared to be false. Bhikkhu Bodhi suggests that this is because the premise of the question that there is a self is mistaken, which raises a whole host of different problems and is probably false. And this relates to the question that was previously asked about the self. It is not my view that with the doctrine of anatta, that the Buddha is saying there is no self in any sense. He is criticizing a very specific Indian conception of a self, and this could also be be taken also as a refutation of the concept of a soul, which theistic religions also have. And it is the static, extended, permanent, and blissful self as being an actual being in the world, if you like, that the Buddha is criticizing. Obviously, the Buddha believes in a self in some sense because it's self-evident that we have some kind of self-consciousness. The question what the ultimate state is one that will we will be progressively unfolding and discussing as we make our way through the suttas. However, right after this statement, the Buddha explains why all logical variations of this axiom are false. So he explains the reason himself in the sutta why this tetralemma of the atta, relating to the atta, why all variations of it are incorrect. And he says, quote, as far ananda as designation and the range of designation reaches, as far as language and the range of language reaches, as far as concepts and the range of concepts reaches, as far as understanding and the range of understanding reaches, as far as the cycle reaches and revolves, that monk is liberated from all that by super-knowledge, unquote. Super-knowledge is Walsh's translation. It's a somewhat unpleasant term. It really means higher or transcendent or transrational knowing, really equivalent to the English word gnosis. We actually do have a word in English which would do perfectly well for this concept that Walsh translates as super-knowledge, and that's simply gnosis. Glow Phoenix says, can't be said that Buddha's view is that awareness is not about the self, not about not-self. Okay, I have no problem with formulating it that way. Awareness, contentless awareness, simply is itself, and it's not about anything, really. It simply is the ground of experience. And we'll be discussing this more. I'm trying not to go too far beyond this sutta, but when we get into discussions of the mind stream, the inherent ontological tendency to differentiation, we will be able to discuss this further. Thus, the Buddha makes it clear that the inscrutability of the Tathagata's post-mortem state is neither because he does not exist nor because of the non-existence of a self, but rather due to the limitations of rational linguistic understanding. Clearly, super-knowledge, the word is abhinna, is beyond designations, language, concepts, and rational understanding, which is based on static and dualistic conceptions of existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, and neither existence nor non-existence. The post-mortem status of a Tathagata, therefore, can only be known non-dualistically and trans-dualistically, and therefore no rational dualistic statement concerning it can be true. Similarly, the Buddha rejected static, finite, dualistic conceptions of the self. There is, moreover, a fundamental difference between conceptualization and experience. In the words of Alfred Korzybski, the founder of general semantics, the map is not the territory. Carrying on to discuss the 7 stations of consciousness next. The 7 stations of consciousness correspond to the planes of existence classified according to body and perception. In previous talks, we've discussed the 31 planes of existence, of which the 7 stations are a simplification. And you can see the diagram there, which shows the correlations between the stations, the devas, the different types of devas, which of course also correspond to different planes or ontological levels, if you like, of reality, the jhanas, which is also discussed in previous talks, and then the nature of these devas in terms of body and perception. And in addition to the 7 stations, the Buddha identifies 2 realms, or spheres, The word is ayatanane, consisting of the unconscious beings, or mindless devas, and the inhabitants of the plane of neither perception nor non-perception, which you may recall as the highest plane of samsara above the seventh station of nothingness. The unconscious beings refer to the mindless devas, one of the deva realms corresponding to the fourth jhana, corresponding to a realm of beings that have bodies without consciousness. Rebirth in this plane results from a meditation in which consciousness is suppressed, based on the mistake that the suppression of consciousness is equivalent to liberation, and I suspect that was probably a meditation that was advocated and practiced by some or one or another sect of samanas during the Buddha's life. So the karma of that suppression of consciousness results in a rebirth in a higher state, but it's a higher state in which there is no consciousness, and therefore one is inevitably subject to death and rebirth in a lower state, obviously, since no development is possible in such a state. Inhabitants of the plane of neither perception nor non-perception have consciousness but no body, and are unable to hear Dharma. I assume that you may recall that the Buddha attained this. The Buddha attained this state of neither perception nor non-perception early on in his spiritual practice under one of the two meditation teachers that he practiced with. I think it was the second, Ramaputta, I think was his name, and he attained that state and then rejected it as not satisfying his quest. The first meditation teacher, he attained the state of nothingness. The second, he attained the state of neither perception nor non-perception. I see that these two are grouped together because they represent different sorts of non-perception. So you can see from the diagram the nature of the body and perceptive apparatus, if you like, of the different beings. Human beings, of course, our bodies are all different and our perceptions are all different. According to this view, Brahma's retinue, the Brahma worlds, which we've discussed in previous talks, the bodies are different, but the perceptions are alike. So in other words, they're very similar. You could say they're psychologically similar, I suppose. In the Abhasara, or streaming radiant devas, the bodies are alike, but the perceptions are different. In the Subhakina devas, which means radiant glory, both the bodies and the perceptions are alike, so they're all very similar to each other. In the plane of infinite space, that is attained by and this is of course one of the jhanas, one of the formless jhanas, the fifth jhana. This is attained by the transcendence of the perception of matter, vanishing of the perception of sense reactions, and non-attention to the perception of variety. And then these subsequent two levels, he doesn't really explain in terms of the jhanas, the body, or the perceptions for the devas of infinite consciousness and nothingness, even though he mentions them. He doesn't give details on those, so neither do I. And that's it for the slides. So let's go on to discuss the 8 liberations, and you'll see there's a correlation between the 8 liberations and this slide of the 7 stations. Finally, the Buddha identifies 8 liberations. The translator notes that these represent a sequence of steps, realizations, if you like, that are necessary in order to attain final liberation. So these are the sequential steps that lead to ultimate emancipation or liberation. First, when possessing form, one sees forms. So one starts with the body, mindfulness of the body. As Buddhaghosa points out, this is the distinctive teaching of the Buddha Dharma, is that one begins with the body. The emphasis, focus on the body, is the central doctrine of Buddha Dharma. According to Buddhaghosa, this is not taught anywhere else. Second, when not perceiving material forms in oneself, one sees them outside. Third, thank you very much, Sabi, for attending. Please note that the talk is available in note card. If you'd like a copy of the note card, just IM me, and I'll be happy to send it to you so you can read the end of it. It's also on my blog. The third realization, I actually prefer the word realization to liberation. The third realization is, and it's quite an interesting one, thinking it is beautiful, one becomes intent on it. And one is accustomed to thinking of Buddhist practice as very ascetic and based on renunciation, but you do find these references to sensuality, not in any grotesque way, but in a very refined, subtle way, including, interestingly, when the Buddha's mother, Mahanidana, conceived the Buddha, she became spontaneously virtuous and pure and became exquisitely sensitive to the beauty of the world around her in a purely non-sensual, refined, aesthetic way. So this is actually a stage in the development of the jhanas. Thinking it is beautiful, one becomes intent on it. Fourth, completely transcending all perception of matter by the vanishing of the perception of sense reactions and by non-attention to the perception of variety, thinking space is infinite, one enters into and abides in the sphere of infinite space. This corresponds to the fifth station, you'll note. Fifth, thinking consciousness is infinite, one enters and abides in the sphere of infinite consciousness. This corresponds to the sixth station. Sixth, thinking there is no thing. Glow Phoenix asks, is thinking of the Dharma beauty like joy? Yes, I would say so. The Dharma does have beauty, and so it would be part of that. It would be part of that sensual or aesthetic, perhaps is a better word, appreciation that he's referring to, which is a feeling of beauty, joy, happiness, etc. Fifth, thinking consciousness is infinite, one enters and abides in the sphere of infinite consciousness. This corresponds to the sixth station. Sixth, thinking there is no thing, one enters and abides in the sphere of no-thingness. This corresponds to the seventh station. And seventh, transcending the sphere of no-thingness, one reaches and abides in the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. This corresponds to the first realm in Walsh's translation. He calls them realms. Sphere is the more customary translation. And finally, in the eighth realization, yes, aesthetic appreciation, aglow, the ultimate refinement of sensuality, trembling on the edge of jhana. 8, transcending the sphere of neither perception. And there are other references. I think I've talked about them in another connection with another sutta. There are other references to happiness, sensuality, pleasure, enjoyment, etc. The obvious one that comes to mind is metta meditation. And the Buddha says we must drench and suffuse the body and the entire sensual world with the quality of loving kindness. This is quite different from those interpretations of Buddhism which emphasize the ascetic and exclusively. 8th, transcending the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, one enters and abides in the cessation of perception and feeling. This is called Nirodha Samapatti, literally attainment of annihilation. So we've gone from sensuality to annihilation now. A synonym for nirvana, from which it is possible to break through. That's the quote-unquote from the Sutta, and Padmasambhav refers to a leap to the state of a non-returner or an arhat. One of the things I find interesting about this sequence of necessary realizations is that they do include the formless jhanas, which in the Theravada school in particular you will read are not important, are regarded as unimportant, because at his parinibbana the Buddha entered into emancipation from the fourth jhana, which is also true of the arhat. The arhat who attains the fourth jhana will either attains arhatship, or if he still has karmic residue, he'll be reborn in one of the five pure abodes. So from that, some people would infer that and also perhaps from the Buddha's rejection of his meditations based on his attainment of the realization of the sphere of no-thingness and the sphere of neither perception or non-perception. There are those who would hold that the formless jhanas are relatively unimportant and not necessary to attain emancipation, even though in his paranibbana, the Buddha did in fact go up, according to the Sutta, the Mahanidana Sutta, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which we're going to be discussing next week, the account of the Buddha's last year of life, for those who don't know. He did go all the way up from the first jhana to the 8th. So he experienced all of the form jhanas and all of the formless jhanas. Then he dropped down to the 4th jhana, and then he achieved, and then he died. He entered into perfect parinibbana from the 4th jhana. So there is something to that. There is something about the 4th jhana which I still cannot clearly explain. I'm still looking for an explanation of that, a peculiarity, but not rejecting anything in the suttas, accepting everything in balance with everything else. Based on this sutta, one would have to say that attaining all of the jhanas, including the formless jhanas, is a necessary precursor to emancipation. So that's a very interesting inference that we can draw from this list. Concerning this, the Buddha says, quote, "When once a monk attains these 8 liberations in forward order, in reverse order, and in forward and reverse order," so he leaves no doubt whatsoever, entering them and emerging from them as and when and for as long as he wishes. In other words, one has to have perfect mastery of all of these jhanas, and has gained by his own super knowledge here and now both the destruction of the corruptions, which are the asavas, consisting of sensual pleasures, craving for existence and ignorance, and the uncorrupted liberation of heart, and liberation by wisdom. The monk is called both ways liberated. There is no other way of both ways liberation that is more excellent or perfect than this, unquote. Similarly, as we shall see in connection with the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which, as I said, we'll be discussing next week, when the Buddha died, he rose, to use a metaphor, through the plains and descended them again, and then reascended to achieve the ultimate state of parinibbana. Similarly, the paticca samuppada, sorry, I keep saying paticca samuppada, it's actually paticca samuppada, has 2 directions. And again, this is metaphorical. The natural order is that from ignorance, or in the variation presented in this sutta, consciousness, to birth, old age, and death, which is the cycle of samsara, whereas the order that is against the current, to use a phrase which we've encountered in a previous sutta, leading from birth, old age, and death to ignorance consciousness, leads to liberation. So you have to reverse the sequence of the paticca samuppada in order to achieve emancipation. We would call these entropy and negentropy, respectively. That is to say, we see this reflected in the causal realm in terms of principle of entropy, universal degeneration, and negentropy, universal innate intelligence, actually, is a nice term that some people use, which coexist. We, of course, are the negentropic aspect of the universe. We meaning sentient beings. I would also point out the emphasis on the here and now, the present moment. I see your question, a glow phoenix. I'm just going to finish my thought and then I'll address it. I would also point out the emphasis on the here and now, the present moment, which alone is real, as I've discussed in my series of talks called Fundamental View, in connection with the problem of past and future in the context of the problem of rebirth and samsara. I went into that in some length in my series of 10 talks on the Pali Canon, which some of you may have attended, in which I reduce past, present, and future to the universal present and its implications for rebirth, and how that solves a problem to do with rebirth in the context of samsara. A glow phoenix asks, so liberation is found in both body and mind. Well, body one begins with the body. When one achieves liberation, I would say liberation is the liberation from body and mind. Body, mind, nama-rupa, and the consciousness that underlies it, these are all still samsaric states. So in the state of liberation, one has transcended the dichotomy of body and mind and all other dichotomies as well. And so body and mind, liberation is found through the analysis and experience of body and mind, but they're not found in body and mind. I'm not quite sure what you mean by in that context. Emancipation is emancipation from everything that is describable, everything dualistic. We can achieve a kind of intuition of it, but we can't really understand the state of enlightenment or liberation simply because it transcends every effort at description. Taoism has, you're saying, Glow Phoenix says, that Taoism has reversal as a primary principle and inherent capacity and inherent wisdom. Okay, thank you for that. The study of Taoism is very valuable in terms of Buddhism. It's very remarkable, the similarities between Taoism and Buddhism, since there probably was no actual causal nexus between them. But it is very remarkable that at approximately the same time, these two philosophies emerged in relatively close proximity to each other. So the study of Taoism and the Tao Te Ching and the other Taoist writings is very valuable to the understanding of Buddhism, in my view, even though that's not a view that's very popular in Tibet, which is and I'm officially I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, but I have a lot of respect for Taoism, as does the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama actually says he has a lot of respect for the Chinese Dharma. Aglow Phoenix says, I meant mind and heart, as the sutra says. Ah, yes, well, there's liberation by wisdom and there's liberation of the heart. And one can be one way liberated or both ways liberated. The ideal, and this is discussed in other suttas, and again, this is the two paths that I mentioned. The path of dispassion is the liberation of the heart, which is, if you like, I don't really like the term inferior, but it's technically the secondary path of dispassion or monasticism or detachment or renunciation, and the primary path, which is the solution or cure to ignorance, which is the path of wisdom. Liberation is found in both mind and heart. Liberation is found through mind and heart, and it can be either or both. You can be liberated one way or you can be liberated both ways. But obviously to be liberated both ways is the superlative attainment, and that's the attainment of the Buddha. Okay, PicCC, thank you very much for attending. Once again, if you want a copy of the note card, just IM me and I'll be happy to send it to you. So, to conclude, and actually I'm just about to talk about what you asked me about, the liberation of heart refers to dispassion based on the factor of desire, which, as you can see, is as I mentioned, is halfway through, approximately halfway through the sequence of the links in the Paticcasamuppada. The liberation by wisdom refers to the antithesis of ignorance, the root factor of the Paticcasamuppada, in the complete 12-link variation previously discussed, which is the complete diagram, if you like. The former refers to the liberation of the Arhat, whereas the latter refers to the liberation of a Bodhisattva. Together they constitute the liberation of an Arhat Buddha, which is the perfect liberation. The Buddha is always referred to as an Arhat. An Arhat is never referred to as a Buddha. A distinction, a disequilibrium or disjunction, if you will, which is important and which you should note. It's also historically important in terms of the early Buddhist councils. So the liberation of an Arhat Buddha, which is the ultimate liberation of a Bodhisattva, of course, not an Arhat, is the perfect liberation. And as the correspondence with the 31 planes of existence shows, as the correspondence with the 31 planes of existence, the basis of Buddhist ontology clearly shows, These attainments are not merely psychological. This is something we have to constantly remind ourselves of in the West, because we've inherited this Cartesian dualism between mind and matter. In all wisdom traditions, mind and matter are one, not two, as in Descartes. So these attainments are not merely psychological, they are also ontological. And that completes my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to, before we repeat the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, I'm happy to discuss or answer questions. If anyone has anything they would like to discuss, or if anyone has any questions. I'll give you a minute. While you're thinking, I would like to encourage you to join the Dharma Transmission to the West group if you're interested in following my activities. And also, we do have a sim now, the Zhuangzhong sim in Visit Atoll. I'll just type the name. You're welcome to visit us anytime. Did I spell that wrong? I did. And if you would like a copy of the note card of this talk, please just send me a request. I'll be happy to provide it to you. Seems there are no questions. So let's conclude with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege to do so. I will return next week. We'll be discussing the Mahanidana Sutta next Sunday at 2 p.m. Second Lifetime. Thank you very much. Namaskar.